Hello everyone, welcome to RC lesson number 6. And today we are going to hit a topic that I rarely get asked about directly, but it's kind of always lurking in almost everything that I do when I teach RC. And that is the subject of reading faster. So without any further ado, get right into it. So what we will cover. Almost everyone can benefit from clearing the reading part of reading comprehension faster. The key difficulty for most of you, even those of you who are reading relatively quickly, like a minute or 2 minutes or change on a passage, the key difficulty, as I was saying, is making sure you can get an acceptable amount of comprehension to go along with that rapid reading. Students tend to grossly and tragically overestimate the importance of actually understanding details. On the other hand, students also tend to grossly and tragically underestimate the value of keeping a good bird's eye view of the entire passage. You've probably heard some version of this before. I myself have said it in almost every single one of the RC lessons that I can think of. But what remains for you to do here, now that you've heard of the idea, is to train yourself to read differently than you currently do. So how do you actually go about doing that? I break it roughly into 2 steps. The first is to prove to yourself that you can get away with reading less and not understanding details. This happens in untimed practice. The second step generally is to practice doing that same thing faster. And obviously this is where time practice comes in. So step 1, proving to yourself that you can read less. You do not need to be able to answer the question, what exactly is this detail? Insert detail here. You do want to be able to answer the question, why is this detail included here? The second question can be answered with far less reading and absolutely zero rereading compared to the first, and that's where a lot of the speed gains are going to live for most of you here. So to prove to yourself the extent to which you personally can read less and still perform well, I suggest selecting any one RC section from prep test number 54 and higher. You can still do older ones, but I would say that there has been something of a I don't really know how to describe it because it's not really that tangible, but there has been a change in reading comp over the years, and I would say 54 is about as far back as you can go and still be safe in terms of relevance. So once you've found a passage to do, or a section to do, rather, read the first non-comparative passage completely untimed. And so in terms of that reading, move with some sense of urgency, but don't really push yourself to read particularly fast. Every single time you want to reread something during this process, just don't. Do the whole why is this detail here question instead. As you're reading and not fully understanding the difficult details, just note where these difficult details reside in the passage so you can refer back to them should a question or answer choice demand it. And as you're reading, pretty importantly, also keep track of where the overall discussion is at each paragraph. So is the author expanding on the second of 2 points that were introduced in paragraph 1? Is paragraph 3 where the author explains the new or competing theory? That sort of thing. Just try to track where the discussion has progressed to. And then continue reading the passage in this way until you finish. Once you've done that, move into the questions, also doing them completely untimed. And as you do questions, try to rely on your where is the discussion in each paragraph sort of mental roadmap to find details more efficiently as needed. One thing I do want you to take a note of as you're doing questions untimed is that even without a full repeated reread of the passage the first time through, and understanding the complex details, you should be able to find where those details are should a question or answer choice demand it. If a detail still doesn't make sense to you at this stage, the key insight here is realize that the result likely would have been the same had you tried rereading it on your first pass 2 or 3 times. The only difference now is that you'd have wasted more time rereading, but you managed to avoid that because I just told you not to do it. So repeat the process outlined on the previous slide for the remaining 2 non-comparative passages in the section. Note your performance on the questions. Obviously, you're going to do that for any kind of practice that you do. But aside from some initial discomfort, most people discover that reading less and faster doesn't really change how well they do, especially if you just do if you're not just trying to physically read all the words faster, but kind of reading strategically faster as I described. You kind of end up more or less in the same place. Feel free to try the comparative reading passage after you've done the standard format passages, but I really don't consider those comparative passages that helpful as part of this exercise. Practice is still practice, it'll still help, and you do have to eventually learn how to adapt this kind of stance to that kind of passage, the comparative passages. But in terms of this step, just kind of practicing the speedy strategic reading, the comparative passage is really not the best setup for that. And so at this point, now that you've done it on a passage and you've tried to repeat it on a bunch of different passages, basically you've done 3 passages this way. I would say this is where your first decision point is. If you feel comfortable with changing your reading style, this doesn't have anything to do with how many questions more or less you're getting right or wrong. But if you just feel like, okay, I can do this. Maybe not everything is in place, but I can do this. It feels like it might work. Move immediately to step 2, which we'll discuss in a little bit, and it's really about doing this faster. So it's basically going to be more of the same, just faster. If you're not sold on the changes yet, but are interested in trying it more, and be like, I don't really know, you don't really feel like you know whether or not to make the call. I would encourage you to just repeat the untimed process for a maximum of 2 more full RC sections. So basically, by the time you're done, you'll have done the same exercise on a total of at least 9 passages, maybe 12 if you include all the comparatives. And if you're not sold on the changes and you have no interest in trying to make it work because you've tried it and you just really, really feel like this is a wall I can't get over, this strategy isn't for me, just stop. Stop burning passages. Try whatever else you want to for RC, because I really have nothing else, because in my 15 years of teaching, this has been the most consistent strategy. And I do want to add a little caveat here that as I'm recording this, I didn't have time to actually type it out. Do note that everything that I suggest in this video and on my channel is really calibrated towards sort of a self-selecting group that comes to me. Most people who come to me due to my credentials and my price tend to be in the 160 plus range already and are really shooting to get over the 170 line. And if that doesn't really describe you, there's a chance that you may need to do some preliminary work before this applies to you, or this just doesn't apply to you at all. So I am not at all afraid of admitting that, hey, my methods are not for everybody, and they're not really designed that way either. So now onto the promised step 2, doing all this stuff faster. Now that you have a sense of how a more minimal strategic reading works, it's now time to put it under the clock. I would suggest start by taking another RC section from the same range, numbered 54 and higher. Don't do the entire section under a timer. Instead, take the first, again, non-comparative passage and give yourself 5 minutes to do the reading and 10 minutes to do the questions. And yes, 15 minutes for a single passage is quite generous. If that's way too much time for you personally, if you're already doing it faster than that, in untimed practice, start with 3 minutes of reading and 8 minutes of questions, or a different balance, but roughly you want to spend about twice as much time with the questions as you are on the reading. As you keep practicing, ratchet down the timing for both the reading phase and the questions phase until you're down to an ideal pace of roughly 2 minutes of reading paired with 6 minutes of questions for a standard difficulty passage. And by standard difficulty, I mean for you. Sometimes people consider passages utter nightmares, and you're like, hey, that wasn't actually that bad. It's usually rare that you'll consider it easy when everybody else thinks it's hard, but at the same time, difficulty on reading is different for everybody. So if you're looking at a passage, you're like, okay, this feels more or less average for you. On that grade of difficulty of passage for you, you want to be hitting the 2 minutes of reading, 6 minutes of questions. Easier ones are going to run faster than that, and the truly monstrous passages that universally are hated will be quite difficult to fit into 8 minutes. So once you get under the 10-minute mark per passage, there's a chance you will need some professional feedback. I find that at roughly 2-3 minutes of reading and 7-8 minutes of questions, we begin to find some of your true weaknesses that have less to do with sort of exam-based things and more to do with how you read and process data. Most of the time, it's that you're not being properly structural while reading. Usually that means that you're not good enough at describing what the author is trying to accomplish at each stage of the passage or within each paragraph. If it were up to me, I'd like to just throw up a list of ideas here. This paragraph introduces the unique feature of X thing that the critics are wrong about, and so on and so forth, and just give you a bullet point list of the different ways to describe a paragraph. But years of experience has taught me that that really doesn't work. Each passage is different, each person reading the passage is different, and for me, I've found that there's just too much variability to just kind of throw that one-size-fits-all list and expect you to really make use of it. For me, so what I found is that the best way to sort out your personal deficiencies at this stage is to talk to a tutor or refer to my program or other programs, various different RC materials, to see if there's a certain sort of mental language that we use that you are not. That tends to be what I find to be the most effective, fastest, and most efficient path for an individual student to improve how they approach this structural aspect. And just to be clear, the structural thing that I'm referring to really is directly relevant to the mental roadmap that I was talking about in terms of keeping track of where the discussion is at each point of the passage. So making sure that you have that overall bird's eye view. That's what this is all about. So most of the time, because the concept of taking a step back and looking at the passage as a whole isn't a particularly complex idea, what you're really probably missing is just a more effective way of describing what it is that you're looking at. So, as I promised in a previous lesson where I mentioned that this lesson was going to be brief, we're already at the end here. So step one overall is to read minimally in untimed practice. Do not reread stuff that you don't understand, but instead merely try to understand why that stuff is there. As you read, keep track of how the discussion is moving on a paragraph by paragraph basis using that sort of structural reading I talked about. Every time you look at a paragraph or every time you finish a paragraph, try to sum it up in your head. Okay, what was the author actually trying to accomplish here? And then after you've done that reading, do questions again untimed. Note that some details that you refer back to will still be confusing, and that's fine, and that's good, and that's expected. You'd still be just as confused had you reread it 3 or 4 times the first time through, except now with this drill you just managed to avoid that waste. When you're comfortable with your performance in step 1, move to time practice. So step 2, start at 15 minutes per passage, and again keeping a balance of roughly twice the time for questions as compared to time for reading. And if that's too slow, feel free to start at a lower time like 12 or 11 minutes. That seems to be where a lot of you 170 plus aspirants are trying to go for. And then just keep ratcheting down the time slowly and steadily until you're spending about 8 minutes per passage. If you hit a wall around the 10-minute mark, which many of you will, you'll either start getting a lot of questions wrong that you normally wouldn't had you done your normal style, or you're just having trouble moving the timer down. Talk to me, talk to another tutor, or find another resource to figure out your specific problems. Generally, it's probably just going to be some sort of descriptive logical language. Again, it's not the concepts that you don't get. It's how to describe them in efficient terms that make sense to you. So just kind of developing your own code, so to speak. And that's it. We have reached the stage where I must pander to the algorithm. Thanks everybody for being here. Like and subscribe to help the channel. Leave a comment. The engagement gods like that, but you guys tend to not really want to be putting those out there. More commonly, you guys are emailing me directly, which I welcome just as much. If you have any further questions, and also tutoring inquiries should always be directed to that email as well. So I will see you guys in the next one.